The name Blazing Skies and the awesome cover art depicting two biplanes locked in an aerial dogfight above war-torn fields caught my attention and made it stand out on the shelves when I saw it in a store as a child. But as children, we quickly discover that you should never judge a book by its cover, because it may not reflect what you get inside, as I learned when I plugged this game in, shrugged off the bland, boring pre-game menus, and jumped into what I expected to be an awesome arcade dogfight, like that promised to me by the box art. Only to be faced with this. Yeah, suffice to say, it's not quite what I was hoping for. What we have here is a shoot-'em-up, a genre that despite Starwing's massive success a few months after this game's release, the Super Nintendo isn't generally well remembered for. Blazing Skies is not a great example of this genre, and although there's more to it than that first mission would suggest, it's let down by a myriad of design frustrations and an overall lack of variety, which makes it hard for me to recommend to shoot-'em-up fans. On paper, Blazing Skies actually looks quite good. For a start, rather than just playing as a nondescript, random pilot in an aircraft like in most shooters, Blazing Skies presents you with a roster of 5 pilots to choose from. You can pick any one of them before starting a mission, and take them on whichever missions you choose. Despite what their descriptions imply, for example Lieutenant Pretty Boy here is supposedly a better pilot than the others, there's no advantage to picking one over the other. But what's interesting about these pilots is that they are used to incorporate an RPG element into Blazing Skies. Whenever you successfully complete a mission, you're taken to a simple stat screen where you can assign experience accumulated from the mission to 4 different attributes, each one improving a specific aspect of a pilot's performance. Say, improving the flight skill makes your aircraft more maneuverable, and improving shooting increases the fire rate and the range of your gun, which translates to better performance in missions and is essential for later missions. What's more, fail a mission? Well, you can still move on, but that pilot will get downgraded, or maybe even dismissed. Get shot down? That pilot's just gone for good. Although it's hardly what I'd call in-depth, it's quite a cool idea anyway. It gives you a tangible reward for doing well, and it gives you a reason to give a toss about whether or not your pilot lives or dies. At least at first, at any rate. Once you've maxed a couple of pilots out, you can just kinda spam the password system every time you lose one, which does sort of undermine the entire point. But it makes things more interesting nonetheless. And the fact that there is a password system is an utter relief, even if it does use codes a mile long that incorporate every single digit in existence. Except for the letter A. Well, that would just be overdoing it now, wouldn't it? There are 3 different mission types in this game, each of which plays differently. Dogfighting, where you fight enemy planes, strafing, where you make high-speed, low-altitude strikes against ground targets, and bombing, where you drop bombs on designated ground facilities, and you'll alternate between these mission types as you progress through the game. Unfortunately, despite this initial promise, it's once you start playing the game that things start to go downhill, as the gameplay just isn't up to scratch, and each mode suffers from its own set of issues, which makes the whole game quite frustrating. Let's start with dogfighting, where you'll be spending most of your time. In this mode, you're placed in an open environment in which you're given pretty much full freedom of movement, and are tasked with outmaneuvering and shooting down a number of aircraft, by getting behind them, or into a position where they cross your line of fire. In a game like this, good controls are an absolute must, and this is where you find your first problem. The controls themselves are actually quite easy to pick up. I feel I need to be clear about this now. Despite what certain articles on the net imply, this is not a flight sim in any way. It's arcade all the way. As such, the task of flying the plane is quite simple. You can pull up or dive, bank left or right, fire the guns, or slow down and speed up. That's it really. You don't have to deal with anything more complicated like controlling flaps or even landings and takeoffs. The problem here is that actually controlling the aircraft is a major bitch. At least at first, the act of simply pulling up or banking to turn, or trying to recover from a dive feels like a real struggle. The controls feel stiff and temperamental, as if the aircraft doesn't want to do it, and is a lot more interested in killing you. It's kinda hard for me to be more precise about what I mean, without taking up more review time. But trust me, give this game a shot and you will immediately feel frustration set in, and you'll see what I mean.
One thing I have no trouble relaying to you in this review is that this makes getting behind an enemy and lining up shots difficult, as you feel like you have to fight your aircraft for control while simultaneously trying to fight the enemy, and you'll even find it's very likely to get you killed as maneuvers go wrong simply because the aircraft is such a pain to control. Now, just before I move on, just to save myself a few messages later on, in real life these planes were notorious for killing their pilots more than the enemy did, and I suspect that part of the reason the plane is such a pain to control is it's possible the developers were trying to replicate this tendency to an extent. If that's the case, then it's great that they had the ambition to give this a go, but it just manifests itself as a complete pain in the arse. After that little rant, you'll be surprised to hear it does get easier. As you increase your pilot's flying skill, the aircraft becomes more agile, and it feels less like it's trying to impede everything you do. And when maxed out, you can actually pull off some maneuvers that make things easier. For example, the S maneuver, which allows you to turn 180 degrees quite quickly. But even then, it still feels like it's trying to fight you, and it will still get in your way when you're trying to keep up with an enemy. Though I should mention, although you'll be having trouble with a flight model, the AI doesn't seem to have any trouble with it at all. There are other problems to deal with as well, which might all seem very minor in themselves, but together they don't help, and again, the AI seems to have no problem with them at all. For one thing, you have no speed gauge. This is a problem because if you slow down too much, you'll stall the engine and start plummeting to the ground. So, when you're trying to stay behind an enemy who's slowing down, thus you too must slow down, how slow is that bit too slow? Well, you can use the sound of the engine and the scrolling terrain to give you a vague idea, but the fact is that they don't give you a good enough idea, leading to repeated stalls. A speedometer would have made this issue a little less problematic. Even firing at the enemy is a pain in the arse in this game, mainly because of the next problem, in that you don't have any crosshairs. As a result, it's very difficult to actually hit anything, because you have no way of reliably judging where your bullets are going to go when you start firing, so more often than not, they're going to go wide. And what about your weapons range? Well, your range is limited, so obviously you have to get within a certain distance of the enemy to actually hit them. Unfortunately, just as you have no crosshair, you have nothing to tell you whether you're actually in range, and precise distance from the enemy is very difficult to judge by sight in this game. The result is that you often just have to fire away as you close on your target until you just happen to get into range. It also doesn't help that your view is permanently fixed behind your plane, which is permanently dead center in the middle of the screen, so if the enemy is directly in front of you, well, good luck with that. In fact, this fixed perspective leads me to my final frustration. Because your view is permanently fixed behind you, you have no way of knowing what's going on around you. Where's the enemy? Which way do I have to turn to find them? Are they about to get in behind me? Do I need to evade? You have absolutely no way to know, because unless they're directly in front of you, you just can't see them, so you just have to pick a direction and hope for the best. Confusingly, the L and R buttons do nothing in this mode, so simply setting them to allow you to look left and right quickly would have helped immensely. But as it is, you're more likely to get shot down or collide with the enemy before you see them in time. In fact, at least in my experience, as the game goes on, collisions become more and more frequent. And this isn't helped by dodgy collision detection. So basically this review has been far from positive so far. But in the interest of balance, I suppose there is some fun to be scraped from Dogfighting. With a bit of time and effort, although they'll still cause you problems all the way, you can get used to a lot of the issues that I've already mentioned. You can get used to the flight model, at least to the point where you can do a decent job controlling it. You will eventually learn to apply a mental crosshair, and you sort of get a feel for how close you have to be to the enemy to shoot them down, or avoid collisions, and you'll be able to get behind the enemy without too much fuss and shoot them down, which does provide a quick thrill as you plunge bullets into them and watch them fall to the ground. But unfortunately that's all it provides, a quick thrill, a quick sense of satisfaction, and that's it. Once you've gotten used to the aforementioned issues, you'll realise that by far the biggest issue with Dogfighting is that it's actually quite boring, as every match is basically the same mission, facing harder and harder versions of the same enemy, turning in a great big circle until they pop up in front of you, you get behind them, hit them, repeat until dead, and you're rewarded with just a few seconds thrill when they die, and then move on. All that effort and frustration for that, it just doesn't seem worth it to me. As I said before, the other two modes also have problems. This review is taking a little bit more time than I feel the game is worth, so I'll try and be brief. which if you've watched my previous videos you know doesn't come to me naturally, but hopefully it shouldn't be too hard as both modes essentially suffer from the same set of problems. I've already mentioned earlier in the review what you do in each mode, but I did forget to mention that bombing missions ditch the Mode 7 and, thankfully, the flight model in favour of a more traditional top-down view. Now, have a look at this footage. See a problem? Hopefully, you'll see that in both modes, where at first there's nothing, suddenly your target pops into view and you only have seconds to react. In both modes, you simply can't see far enough ahead of you to be able to get into position to engage your target, and you have absolutely nothing to help you guesstimate even roughly where they'll be until they pop into view. The only way to go is to memorise where the enemy will pop up, and even then, it's still a pain in the arse. Less so in bombing missions because targets can be quite large, and they always sit still, but some targets, like this bridge, are ridiculously small even close up. Out of the two though, it's worse in strafing, as you still have that homicidal flight model and lack of a crosshair to contend with, and targets are almost always quite small and thus difficult to hit. Once you've memorised where the targets pop up, it does become a lot easier to hit them. You just get into position and then blow them away. But then the same problem I mentioned in Dogfighting rears its ugly head again. Once you've finally gotten past the frustrations you're faced with, what you're left with really isn't that much at all. You basically just fly in, hit the target, move on. I suppose when taken as a whole, that's the biggest issue with Blazing Skies. Ultimately, the frustrating elements I've mentioned can be overcome by repeated playthroughs and they become less of a problem. But although many shooters have their fair share of frustrations which you have to master, and often require you to memorise where enemies and other things are to get good at the game, most of the good ones make you feel like your efforts were worth it. While mastering this poorly designed game just left me wondering, why did I bother? Now, last but not least is presentation, and although a bit of a mixed bag, it's not too bad. Enemy planes look a bit naff, and I suspect the way they scale in and out is what makes distance from them so difficult to judge, and ground targets and strafing missions look a bit blurry and very difficult to distinguish. On the other hand, your plane looks quite decent with a decent amount of detail, even though you're going to be spending most of your time admiring its backside. And although it's basically just one very short texture being reused in every dogfighting and strafing mission, the use of Mode 7 for the ground does provide quite a cool effect, and gives you an impression of flying above a landscape, albeit an extremely flat one. Bombing missions look a lot less adventurous to say the least, but what's there is functional and does its job well enough. Music is also quite good as well. Like the graphics, it's hardly blow-away quality, but it sounds good and it fits quite nicely with the game. Unfortunately, there just isn't that much of it. There's only a few tracks, which is why you may very well be hearing quite a few of them repeating again and again during this review, that I just don't have enough to work with. Well, that's Blazing Skies. Despite decent presentation and looking good on paper with the pilot system and 3 different mission types, once you actually get into the game, what you find is gameplay that on the whole is quite poor. Due to a myriad of frustrations down to poor design decisions and very little in the way of reward for your efforts, as well as a lack of variety that ultimately renders the game just boring. If you're looking for a shooter to play, rather than just to add to the shelf, then I cannot recommend Blazing Skies. For the $5 that this game would cost, there are shooters out there that are far more worthy of your time and your efforts. Thanks for watching another episode of Retro Strike. As usual, feel free to leave me a comment and I'll see you next time.